Imagine waking up, pouring yourself a hot cup of coffee, turning on the news, and there it is again. Another headline screaming, "Trump says trade talks are on," only to be followed by, "China denies everything." You shake your head, maybe roll your eyes, because let's be honest, we've been here before. It feels like deja vu, doesn't it? Two superpowers, one global economy, and a never-ending tug of war over truth. One side calls it fake news. The other side, just as confident in their own version of reality. But here's the question. Who's telling the truth? And more importantly, why should you care? You see, this isn't just about politics or posturing. This is about your retirement savings, the price of your groceries, whether the factory down the street keeps its lights on, whether your 401k dips or grows. Now, maybe you've lived through a few presidential terms. Maybe you remember the NAFTA debates, the Great Recession, or the dot-com crash. You've seen leaders talk tough and markets tank. So when headlines clash, you don't just ask, what happened? You ask, what's really going on behind the curtain? In this video, we're not just going to replay the same old news clips. We're going deeper into the tangled timeline of US-China trade talks, into the psychology of the market, and into the stories of real Americans caught in the middle of all this uncertainty. And maybe, just maybe, we'll uncover the truth the headlines forgot to tell you. Let's get into it. Let me take you back to 2018, a year that, in many ways, lit the first match in the modern US-China trade war. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, I remember that mess, stick with me. Because when you actually line up the key moments from then until now, a pattern starts to emerge. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. So here's a quick snapshot, like flipping through the pages of a tense thriller. March 2018, President Trump announces sweeping tariffs on steel and aluminum, targeting multiple countries, but with China clearly in his sights. China responds with tariffs on American products, everything from pork to soybeans. Suddenly, American farmers are caught in the middle. That summer, things escalate. The U.S. hits $34 billion worth of Chinese goods with tariffs. China matches it. Back and forth it goes, tit for tat. And this isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet, it's families, small businesses, investors, all trying to figure out what tomorrow looks like. Now, I remember talking to a small business owner in Ohio around that time. He imported machinery parts from China. Overnight, his costs jumped 25%. He didn't blame one party or another, he just needed stability to plan ahead. And that's the part that rarely makes it into the headlines. Fast forward to late 2019, the so-called Phase 1 deal is signed. Markets rally, hope returns. But under the surface, the real issues, technology transfer, intellectual property, state subsidies, remain unresolved. And most of the tariffs, still in place. Then 2020 hits. COVID-19 turns the world upside down. Trade talks stall. The focus shifts to masks, vaccines, and survival. But the economic scars of the trade war, they don't just vanish. By 2021 and 2022, the Biden administration inherits the chaos. But instead of rolling back tariffs immediately, they hold the line, reassessing, recalibrating, and some would argue continuing the pressure. And here we are today, in a world still uncertain about whether these negotiations are even happening. You have President Trump doubling down on his narrative. We're in talks, deals are coming, while China flatly denies any such thing. So what does this timeline show us? To me, it reveals something deeper than policy. It shows us how communication, or the lack of it, can shake markets, confuse voters, and leave business owners stranded. And when world leaders weaponize uncertainty, regular folks pay the price. But this story isn't finished yet. Because next, we're going to look at the people doing or not doing the negotiating. Who's really at the table? Who's calling the shots? Let's dive into that. So here's the thing. How do you negotiate with someone who won't say who's at the table? Sounds absurd, right? But that's exactly what's been happening. President Trump has often claimed that negotiations with China are ongoing, that teams are meeting and that deals are being discussed. But when reporters press for details, who's on the team, where did they meet, what was actually said, he tends to dodge the specifics. Sometimes he'll say, "We might tell you later," or just pivot the conversation entirely. Now contrast that with China's approach. Their foreign ministry has been clear, sometimes blunt. There are no current negotiations. But here's where it gets tricky. China's language often plays a semantic game. They may deny formal negotiations while allowing behind-the-scenes talks to continue through back channels. They control the narrative just as carefully, maybe even more so than the US does. To the average viewer, this sounds like a simple disagreement, but if you've lived through a few decades of political gamesmanship, you know better. This isn't just poor communication. It's a strategy. Historically, leaders on both sides have used ambiguity as a tool. Remember Nixon's madman theory? Or Reagan's vague but threatening rhetoric toward the Soviet Union? Sometimes being unpredictable is meant to give your side an advantage. But there's a fine line between strategic ambiguity and outright confusion. Let me give you an example. In 2010, after Trump tweeted that talks were going well, markets jumped. Investors bought in, believing progress was being made. But within days, Chinese officials denied any such talks. The markets dipped, and thousands of ordinary Americans, retirees, small investors, were caught in that emotional and financial whiplash. From where I sit, that's the most frustrating part. It's not just about what's true or false. It's about how a lack of clarity creates anxiety. For people who have no seat at the negotiating table, but every stake in the outcome. And I think we deserve better. Because if leaders want to play chess with each other, fine. But don't use working families, business owners, and retirees as pawns. That's why in the next part of this video, we're going to look beyond the politics and straight into the heart of the market. How does Wall Street react to this mess? Why does it sometimes rise even when everything else feels like it's falling apart? Let's talk about that. Let me ask you something that might sound counterintuitive. Why do the markets go up when everything else seems to be falling apart? I know it doesn't make sense at first. Tensions between two global superpowers, contradictory statements from world leaders, and yet the Dow closes green. You look at your phone, check the stock app, and think, wait, did Wall Street not get the memo? Well, they got the memo. They just read it differently. You see, investors aren't necessarily reacting to what's true. They're reacting to what feels like hope. Let me explain. When President Trump uses a softer tone on China, even if nothing concrete is happening, markets often rally. A single tweet saying talks are going well can add billions in value in just hours. Because investors crave predictability, or at least the illusion of progress. And that's where media manipulation and messaging come into play. Both the White House and China know that markets are listening. So even vague optimism can act like a sugar rush, short-lived, but powerful. I remember one week in 2019 when Trump hinted that China had called the US to resume talks. Markets soared. Later, Chinese officials denied that any call took place. But by then, the market had already moved, and millions of dollars had already changed hands. So is it all just smoke and mirrors? Not entirely. There are real fundamentals at play. Corporate earnings, interest rates, global demand. But in moments of political chaos, psychology takes over. Ken Griffin, a billionaire investor and one of the Republican Party's top donors, said something that stuck with me. He said, America is more than just a country, it's a brand, and we're eroding that brand right now. And you know what? I think he's right. When our leaders speak recklessly or play games with the truth, it shakes confidence. Not just in Washington, but across boardrooms and households alike. Wall Street may respond to tweets in the short term, but it still runs on trust in the long term. And when that trust fades, no amount of soft tone can fix the damage. But here's the twist. While markets may ride the roller coaster of political noise, you don't have to. Coming up next, we'll hear directly from the people who actually live with the consequences of these market swings. Small business owners across America. Because behind every chart and headline, there's a real story. Let's listen to theirs. Here's a question that doesn't come up often enough. Are tariffs just a bargaining chip, or are they becoming part of America's long-term economic playbook? It's easy to think of tariffs as temporary tools, something you use to twist an arm at the negotiating table. But if we look closely at history, at policy, and at the current rhetoric, it's clear this might be more than just short-term strategy. Let's rewind for a moment. Back in the late 1800s, President William McKinley made tariffs a cornerstone of his economic policy. He believed in protecting American industry by making foreign goods more expensive. And for a while it worked. Industries like steel and textiles flourished under his administration. But here's what gets overlooked. That success came at a time when the U.S. was still industrializing, wages were low, there were no regulations, no OSHA, no minimum wage, and globalization wasn't even a concept. America was a very different place. Now fast forward to today. President Trump often references the McKinley era as a model. He sees tariffs as a way to win, to reclaim manufacturing, and to force better deals from foreign powers. But we're no longer in a world of isolated economies. Today, every product, whether it's your iPhone or a pair of sneakers, is built through global supply chains. A single tariff doesn't just hit a foreign factory. It ripples through shipping companies, small retailers, middle-class families, and local farms. I once spoke with a hardware store owner in Missouri. He said, "I don't mind paying more if it helps America, but I wish someone would just tell me how long this is going to last." And that stuck with me because what hurts the most isn't always the tariff itself, it's the uncertainty. You can't build a 5-year plan when policy changes with a tweet. Now, if tariffs are used as a short-term negotiation tool, maybe there's a case. But if they become a permanent fixture, if we start seeing them as the new normal, then we risk turning short-term leverage into long-term damage. History shows that protectionism, when overused, can backfire. It can slow growth, reduce innovation, and isolate us in a world that's moving faster than ever. So the real question becomes, are we using tariffs to open doors or to build walls? Coming up next, we'll hear from the people most affected by these decisions. Not politicians or economists, but the small business owners who are just trying to make payroll, place inventory orders, and keep their lights on. Let's listen to what they have to say. Have you ever wondered what the headlines don't tell you? While politicians debate tariffs and pundits analyze economic theories, there's a quieter, more grounded voice we often overlook, the voice of real American business owners. And their stories? They're not always black and white. Let's start with someone like Mike, who runs a small manufacturing shop in Ohio. He's been around since the late 90s, before smartphones, before the Great Recession, before the trade war was even on the radar. Mike says the tariffs on Chinese imports have actually helped him. By raising the cost of foreign competitors, his American-made parts became more attractive again. He's rehiring, he's expanding. "This is the first time in years I feel like we're on even ground," he told a local paper. Sounds great, right? But just down the road, there's Tina, who owns a boutique furniture store. Most of her pieces rely on imported components, some wood, some hardware, from China and Southeast Asia. Since the tariffs kicked in, her costs have gone up 25 to 30%. She tried eating the cost at first. Then, she had no choice but to raise prices. Sales dropped. Customers walked. She told us, "We're not some mega corporation that can absorb this. We're a family business." This is the dual reality of Main Street America. For every business that thrives under tariffs, there's another that struggles to survive. And it's not just about economics. It's about identity. Some see tariffs as a return to protecting American labor. Others see them as a tax on survival. Here's the thing. It's easy to make sweeping statements from Washington, but it's folks like Mike and Tina who live the consequences every day. From my own experience speaking with small business owners, I've found something else too: resilience. They adapt, they fight, they hustle, but many feel left out of the national conversation. And I think that's a mistake, because this is where policy meets reality. So the next time someone says, tariffs are good or tariffs are bad, maybe we pause and ask, good or bad for whom? When you zoom out, this isn't just a trade story. It's a story about what kind of economy we want to build and who we're building it for. Which brings us to the next big question. In this trade war, who's actually winning and who's losing? Let's take a closer look. Every war has casualties, but what's often overlooked, especially in economic battles like this one, is that it also has unexpected winners. And when it comes to the US-China trade war, the scoreboard isn't as clear as you might think. Let's start with the winners. One big surprise? Some domestic steel and aluminum producers. With Chinese metals slapped with heavy tariffs, US-based companies like Nucor and US Steel suddenly found themselves more competitive. Production ticked up. Stock prices jumped, at least temporarily. It felt for a brief moment like a revival of the Rust Belt. Then there's agriculture, specifically some soybean processors in Brazil and Argentina. Wait, Brazil? That's right. When China retaliated by cutting US farm imports, they turned to South America to fill the gap. So while some farmers in Iowa watched their harvests rot in silos, competitors thousands of miles away stepped in. That's the flip side, because for every industry that gained, another one paid the price. Take American farmers. Many were caught in the crossfire, especially soybean growers who relied heavily on exports to China. Some received federal subsidies, but the emotional toll? That's harder to measure. One farmer told a reporter, "We don't want welfare, we want markets." Then there's the auto industry. Car manufacturers rely on complex global supply chains. Engines from Japan, chips from Taiwan, parts from China. Tariffs made everything more expensive. Assembly slowed. Consumers ended up paying more for the same vehicle. Even everyday goods weren't spared. From washing machines to electronics, Americans began noticing something at checkout. Prices creeping up. Quietly, gradually, but persistently. And when COVID-19 later hit those fragile supply chains, they snapped. What the trade war started, the pandemic finished. Here's my take. When governments talk about economic warfare, they often speak in abstract terms. GDP, trade balances, deficits. But for the average person, it's much more personal. It's the cost of diapers, or whether their small business can source parts on time. I think we should be honest about that, because behind every win on paper is a human cost. And behind every headline about losers, there are people who are doing their best to adapt. That nuance matters. And that's why, as we near the end of this story, we need to ask one final powerful question. What should we learn from all of this? Let's take a moment to reflect together. So after all the headlines, trade talks, tariffs, tweets, intentions, what are we really left with? Let's take a breath and bring it all together. First, if there's one thing we've learned, it's this. Don't trust the headlines at face value. They're designed to grab your attention, not always to give you the full picture. Beneath every deal or disaster is a complicated web of politics, strategy, and, yes, spin. Second, trade wars aren't just about the now. They're part of a much longer game. What looks like chaos might actually be calculation, but that calculation often comes at a cost to real people, real jobs, and real communities. Understanding the long arc of policy, economics, and international power plays helps us make better sense of short-term shocks. And finally, your voice matters more than you think. This isn't just about what happens in Washington or Beijing. It's about what happens in your home, your business, your community. You can vote, you can invest, you can speak up when the narrative feels off or incomplete. And that's how real change begins. Not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. Now, if any part of this video made you stop and think, that's a win. If you learned something new, give this video a like. If you want your friends to stop falling for clickbait or fake news, go ahead and share it. And if you believe these stories, the real ones, need more attention, subscribe. Because we're just getting started. Thanks for spending your time here. Stay curious, stay informed, and above all, stay connected.